Daniel adjusted the cuffs of his plain, well-pressed shirt as he stepped into the lobby of the Grand Meridian, a five-star restaurant whose very air seemed perfumed with money. The glass walls shimmered with embedded displays running silent loops of luxury ads, the kind of future gloss that never failed to remind guests of their place in the pecking order. To the left, an interactive sculpture pulsed with changing light patterns, shifting in sync with the digital feeds of the most influential diners inside. Everyone here was plugged into status, flashing curated metrics of wealth and social reach like digital plumage. Daniel, however, walked through the lobby with nothing on his wrists, no augmented glasses, no glowing cufflinks broadcasting stock values or property holdings. Just himself, steady and unadorned, like a man who'd stepped out of a different century. The maitre d' gave him a glance that flickered between confusion and condescension, then consulted the reservation slate hovering in the air. "Chen family, private suite," he said, voice polished but faintly mocking, as if he doubted Daniel belonged to the clan at all. He led him past velvet partitions into a room glowing gold and glass, where the family had already assembled. The suite smelled of truffle oil and imported wines, laughter bouncing off the tall windows. Aunt Victoria sat at the head of the long glass table, her hair a flawless silver wave, earrings catching the light like signal beacons. She was the matriarch, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, and even before Daniel reached his chair, she was assessing him with the calculating glance of someone who collected weaknesses like trophies. Around her clustered the cousins, each gleaming in their designer armor. Lucas, of course, had taken the spot closest to her right, a subtle but obvious mark of rank. His suit whispered money, custom-tailored with a digital sheen that shimmered whenever he gestured, which he did often. Daniel slipped into the empty chair at the far end. He knew the placement wasn't accidental, it never was. Families like his didn't argue openly over seating, but the positions told the story. Lucas near the Queen, Daniel at the periphery, as if he were some polite afterthought. "Daniel," Victoria said, her voice carrying easily down the table. "How punctual of you. 15 years at the same little job must make one very reliable with clocks." The laughter was quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. Daniel smiled thinly, fingers tightening around his fork beneath the tablecloth. "Still teaching, are you?" chimed in Cousin Marianne, her wrists jangling with 3 slim gold bands that tracked her biometric moods for all to admire. 15 years in the same school. Doesn't it ever feel small, like life is just passing you by? "At least Lucas knows how to take risks," added Uncle Raymond, raising his glass toward Lucas in mock salute. "Always moving forward, eh?" Lucas grinned, teeth perfect, eyes gleaming with the kind of confidence only inflated net worth could buy. "Well, some of us aren't afraid to bet on ourselves. That's how you win big." He leaned back, letting the embedded threads of his suit flare faint blue, a showy display linked to his latest investment's trending numbers. "Stability's nice, I suppose, if you don't mind obscurity." The table chuckled again, and Daniel lowered his gaze briefly to his plate, a simple gesture to disguise the way his jaw had tightened. He'd learned long ago that answering too quickly only fueled them. Silence, patience, and a thin smile, that was his armor. Still, the words cut. 15 years poured into guiding students, into building something meaningful that couldn't be charted in quarterly growth, dismissed in seconds by a family who worshipped only upward graphs. The waiters poured champagne, and Lucas launched into a story about his latest acquisition, a biotech startup with flashy projections. He embellished every detail with gestures that seemed rehearsed, like a performer playing to a captive audience. The relatives nodded, laughed, encouraged him. Daniel sat in the quiet, swirling his water. He had no flashy stories to compete with, no yachts or algorithm-driven penthouses to parade. And yet, he carried something tonight, a secret, not for them, not yet. The door opened again. A ripple went through the room as a new figure entered, Eleanor, introduced by Aunt Victoria with a casual flourish. "A friend of the family," she announced, her smile sharp. Eleanor was striking, not in the overstated way of his cousins, but with a kind of effortless elegance that drew the eye and held it. She wore a deep emerald dress that shimmered like liquid under the lights, her expression quick, amused, as if she saw more than she let on. Lucas was on his feet instantly, pulling out a chair for her near his own. "Elena, right. You're with the investor group?" "Among other things," she said lightly, sliding into the chair, her eyes scanning the table. They landed briefly on Daniel at the far end. Something flickered there, curiosity, recognition, or maybe just amusement at the contrast. The conversation resumed, louder now, with Elena folded seamlessly into the chatter. Lucas wasted no time, peppering her with stories, questions, subtle boasts. The others joined in, eager to impress. Daniel listened, quiet, sipping his drink. And then it came. The inevitable barb, this one sharper than before. Lucas leaned back, flashing a grin. Of course, not everyone here understands the thrill of risk. Take Daniel, for instance. 15 years in the same classroom. Reliable, sure, but safe. Comfort zones aren't where legends are made, right? The laughter was crueler this time, a little freer, as though emboldened by wine and Lucas's lead. Daniel's knuckles whitened on the fork beneath the table. Eleanor tilted her head, eyes glinting as she lifted her glass. She clinked it lightly against Daniel's, leaning just close enough for the table to notice. Her smile was playful, almost conspiratorial. "Funny," she said, voice smooth but carrying across the room. "Everyone acts like stability is boring, but it's the one thing none of you can buy. 15 years. I'd call that priceless." The words landed like a spark in dry tinder. For a heartbeat, the table fell silent. Lucas blinked, his grin faltering. Aunt Victoria's earrings seemed to freeze mid-glitter. Even the waiters paused, glancing nervously toward the head of the table. Daniel turned his head slightly, meeting Elena's eyes. He hadn't expected defense, let alone from someone like her. The heat in her gaze surprised him too. Playful, but edged with something deeper, something that made his pulse tick faster. He gave a small, measured smile, the kind that revealed nothing but carried everything. The silence broke with nervous laughter, someone raising a glass to cover the tension. Lucas forced a chuckle, but his jaw was tight now. "Well," he said, "perhaps. But some of us prefer to live a little larger than priceless stability." Eleanor just sipped her drink, eyes never leaving Daniel. And in that look, in that subtle exchange, the power at the table shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, the faintest tremor leaving his hand as he set down the fork. Years of mockery had built to this moment, and for the first time someone else had spoken what he never allowed himself to. He didn't need to gloat, he didn't need to fight. The seed had been planted, and the room felt different now. Conversation limped forward again, though the energy had shifted. Lucas tried harder, louder, his anecdotes stretched thin. Daniel caught the sidelong glances, Marianne stealing quick looks at him as if reconsidering something, Aunt Victoria tapping her glass in thought. Eleanor's attention darted around the table but always returned to him, each glance like a tug at the edges of his restraint. Dinner stretched on, course after course, and though the family continued their games, status measured in vacations, partnerships, algorithm-boosted followers, the air held tension now. Daniel answered when spoken to, calm and unruffled, his words precise but few. He didn't need to rise to their bait anymore. Eleanor had tilted the board, and he could feel it. When dessert came, a sculpted tower of spun sugar and molecular chocolate, Lucas leaned toward Elena with another of his grand tales, this one about a near deal in Dubai. She smiled politely, but her gaze slid again to Daniel. With the faintest arch of her brow, she asked him, "And you, Daniel?" What does a day in your world look like? It was a simple question, but the table stilled again. No one had ever asked him that, not here. Daniel set down his spoon, voice quiet but firm. My world is full of people who are still deciding who they'll become. I try to help them make that choice with courage. Every day's a chance to change a life. The silence was heavier than before, charged. Lucas's smirk faltered completely this time. Elena's smile deepened, slow and approving, a spark dancing behind her eyes. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight lift. He hadn't bragged, hadn't performed. He had simply spoken truth. And it landed with more force than any stock number or status story could. The night would go on, and there would be more jabs, more veiled remarks. But something had shifted irrevocably. In the quiet space between Elena's glass against his and her unwavering gaze, Daniel realized he wasn't alone at the table anymore. And that, he thought, was the beginning of everything. And condescension. The hum of conversation never truly died in the Grand Meridian's private suite, but after Elena's toast, the rhythm had shifted. Daniel felt it in the way Lucas's laughter grew louder, more forced, each boast about market takeovers stretching like elastic, ready to snap. The cousins leaned closer, egging him on, eager to smooth over the crack Eleanor's words had left in the polished surface of their hierarchy. Aunt Victoria's rings tapped lightly against her glass, her sharp eyes flicking from Daniel to Eleanor and back again, measuring, calculating. "Tell us, Daniel," she said, her tone so sweet it dripped with venom. 15 years nurturing young minds. Admirable. But don't you ever wonder if you've limited yourself? All that potential stalled. It's like buying a sleek car and never driving it faster than 30 kilometers an hour. A chorus of chuckles bubbled up, polite but biting. Daniel lifted his gaze, his lips curved in a faint smile, though his pulse throbbed at his temple. Not every road is about speed, Aunt Victoria. Some are about where they lead. The remark was calm, understated, yet the silence afterward was telling. Eleanor's lips curved as if she'd just tasted something rare and delightful. Lucas barked a laugh, breaking the tension. "Where they lead?" Lucas scoffed, leaning back so his suit projected a cascade of rising numbers across the fabric. "Come on, the world doesn't reward patience anymore. It rewards people who take chances, who own their future. Look around. Every person in this room has made bold moves, grabbed what they wanted. That's why we're here." "And yet," Eleanor murmured, not looking at him but at Daniel, "some things worth having don't need to be grabbed. They arrive because someone built them with care." Daniel's fork hesitated over his plate. The weight of her words curled inside him, pressing against years of silence. He had built something, carefully, quietly, piece by piece. And though no one at this table could see it yet, it was real. Victoria gave a thin smile, shifting the spotlight back. "But boldness, dear Elena, is what pays the bills. What raises families, what sustains legacies. Daniel's chosen a quieter life, and that's his right. But let's be honest, has it really left him with much to show?" Daniel sipped his water, the coolness a sharp contrast against the heat rising in his chest. Every word was a reminder of years dismissed, a life judged small. His hand tightened around the glass stem, and he thought of his students, of the young faces that had walked into his classroom restless, uncertain, and left years later steady, hopeful. He thought of nights spent coding, building, testing, preparing for a world that didn't even know he was coming. Lucas smirked across the table. "Speaking of Daniel, still driving that old sedan? What is it, 12 years old now? Doesn't it break down every month? You should at least invest in a transport pod. Efficiency alone would double your time." "Maybe I like fixing things," Daniel said lightly, though the jab stung. The cousins laughed. "Romantic," Marianne said with a smirk, "but terribly inefficient. These days, even people in middle management trade up every 2 years. Don't you ever get tired of patching up what's broken?" Eleanor tilted her head, her eyes glinting as they found Daniel's. "Some people know the value of holding on," she said softly. "Not everything should be replaced just because something shinier comes along." The words were casual, but her hand brushed his arm under the table as she reached for her glass. The touch was fleeting, warm, charged. Daniel's breath caught before he steadied it, the pulse in his wrist quickening. "They think they've already written your story," she whispered, "only for him. I think you're about to write theirs." Daniel glanced at her, the corner of his mouth threatening a smile. "That's generous," he murmured back. "No," she replied, eyes flicking down to his untouched dessert before returning to his. "That's intuition." Lucas cleared his throat loudly, noticing the exchange though not daring to name it. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with mock pity. "So, Daniel, what's next for you now that your little job's gone? Did they finally decide you'd had your fill of chalk dust and modest paychecks?" The table erupted in laughter. Even Victoria's lips curved into a thin smile, as though she'd been waiting for the moment. The cousins chuckled, their amusement bouncing off crystal and glass, eager to see Daniel squirm. Daniel set his glass down carefully, the sound crisp in the sudden quiet between laughter. His face remained calm, but inside, something shifted. Years of endurance hardened into resolve. He looked at Lucas, then at Victoria, then slowly around the table, meeting each pair of eyes before finally speaking. "Actually," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying easily in the hushed room, "I knew it was coming. I walked away on my own terms." The laughter stumbled, then faltered into silence. "Those years everyone laughs at," he continued. "They weren't wasted. They built something you'll all hear about soon enough." The words landed like stones in water, ripples spreading across the table. A cousin shifted uncomfortably. Marianne frowned. Lucas forced a scoff. "Oh, come on." "Built what? A scrapbook of thank you notes from kids? That's sweet, Daniel, really, but don't pretend it compares to running companies." Victoria sighed delicately, as though brushing dust off her lap. "Dreams are nice, dear. But reality pays the bills. Families need more than ideals, they need results." Daniel's smile remained faint, inscrutable. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let them hear the confidence in his restraint. Eleanor's eyes lingered on him, bright and steady, her lips curving as if she alone understood the weight of what he hadn't said. Lucas leaned back, smug again, but there was tension in his jaw now. He wanted to shake Daniel, to pull him back into the role of the quiet cousin, the harmless teacher. But Daniel didn't give him that satisfaction. He stayed still, calm, the faintest hint of a storm beneath the surface. "Perhaps we should change the subject," Marianne said, a touch too quickly. "Not everyone wants to be reminded of missed opportunities." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound cutting through the tension like silk. "Missed opportunities," she said, her gaze still on Daniel. "I think some people here are about to realize the biggest opportunities aren't always the loudest." The table shifted uncomfortably again, forks clinking against plates. Daniel lowered his gaze to his dessert, but his chest felt lighter, steadier. For the first time in years, he hadn't swallowed his pride. He hadn't raised his voice either, but the truth had slipped through, calm and undeniable. And the silence it left was louder than any of Lucas's boasts. As the evening stretched into its final courses, the pressure didn't ease. If anything, it grew sharper. Lucas jabbed again, circling back to Daniel's modest apartment, his lack of vacations, his plain shirt. Victoria probed with questions wrapped in politeness, each one laced with disdain. But Daniel felt something had shifted inside him. Every barb slid off more easily now, buffered by the spark Elena had lit with a touch and a whisper. He didn't need to prove himself tonight, not yet. He just needed to hold steady, to let them feel the silence he'd planted, the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't playing their game. And across the table, Eleanor's gaze kept returning. each time with that same flicker of amusement, interest, and something warmer. Every glance was a reminder. He wasn't alone at this table anymore. The last golden glow of chandeliers flickered across the Grand Meridian suite as the dinner plates cleared and soft ambient music began to hum in the background, a futuristic blend of piano notes over a gentle synthetic undertone. Daniel sat back for a brief moment, letting the buzz of the table wash over him. Lucas had tried, with increasing desperation, to maintain control, tossing out anecdotes of his latest investments and referencing partnerships he assumed would intimidate anyone else. But tonight, Daniel could see the cracks, the subtle shifts in posture, the sharp intake of breath, the way Aunt Victoria's eyes no longer rested on him with outright scorn, but with calculation, a measuring of weight and possibility. He adjusted his sleeves and glanced at Elena. She had been quiet for most of the dinner, her engagement in the conversation almost seamless, blending flirtation with casual observation. Yet every so often her gaze caught his, and in it was that same spark, that acknowledgement that the table's hierarchy had shifted. She raised an eyebrow, as if daring him to make the move he had held in reserve all evening. Lucas had just finished recounting the 7th story of the night, a tale of an almost deal in the biotech sector, exaggerated for effect. He leaned back, satisfied, expecting nods and laughter. Daniel simply watched, his expression neutral, but his mind calculating. The waiters hovered silently, clearing glasses with robotic precision, oblivious to the tension simmering between human egos and pride. Eleanor leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice so only Daniel could hear. "Ready?" she whispered, brushing a finger lightly along his hand. The touch was deliberate, intimate, and it sent a jolt through him. "Tonight," she said softly, "you're going to finish what you started at dinner." Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. He didn't need courage. He had been patient. He had been invisible long enough to learn how to make silence speak louder than any boast. And now, finally, it was time. Lucas leaned over, smirk in place but with tension tightening the corners of his mouth. "So, Daniel," he said, voice dripping with false amusement, "after 15 years of chalkboards and after-school meetings, what's next? Planning a quiet retirement, maybe? Or are you finally going to get a real job?" The cousins tittered behind him, anticipation gleaming in their eyes. Aunt Victoria adjusted her napkin, her rings catching the light as she poised her hand over her plate. "Yes, Daniel," she said, voice soft but sharp, "do enlighten us. We are all curious what your grand plan might be. Surely it must exist after such unorthodox years." Daniel's eyes swept the table slowly, deliberately, meeting each face. He did not rush, he did not falter. Then he leaned forward, hands resting calmly on the glass surface, and smiled. A quiet, confident curve of lips that drew the room's attention without a word. "Elena," he said, nodding slightly to her, "would you like to start?" A faint smile spread across her face, mischievous and radiant. She rose gracefully, the silk of her emerald dress catching the light, and raised her glass. "Reality, Victoria," she said, her voice carrying with effortless poise. "Then you'll love this. Daniel and I just launched a foundation. Fully funded, scholarships, mentorship programs, community centers, and one of Lucas's biggest investors. Already backing us." Gasps punctuated the table. A cousin whispered, incomprehensible but shocked. Lucas's smirk faltered, eyes widening in disbelief. Aunt Victoria's fork clinked sharply against her plate. Daniel's years of perceived mediocrity, the quiet life he had led, had transformed overnight in their eyes into something formidable. The room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Daniel's heart remained steady, though adrenaline hummed under his skin. He leaned forward slightly, voice calm, resonant, each word deliberate. "You called my years wasted," he said, eyes glinting as he met Lucas and Victoria in turn. "I call them invested, Every late night, every student helped, every failure quietly endured. They built more than a resume. They built something lasting. And maybe the real success, he paused, letting the words sink, isn't what you flash on your wrist, but what you leave behind when you're gone. A stunned silence fell over the table. Some cousins opened their mouths, but no sound emerged. Lucas's jaw tightened. He blinked, as if trying to process a reality that contradicted every lesson he had believed about life and success. Victoria's hands rested stiffly on the table. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, now regarded him with a mix of incredulity and, perhaps, the tiniest hint of admiration. Eleanor slid her hand boldly over his, her fingers warm and deliberate. Her gaze locked onto his, and heat and promise sparked silently across the space between them. "Funny," she murmured, loud enough that the table heard. "Loyalty turns out to be the sexiest investment of all." A ripple went through the room. Some cousins chuckled nervously, shifting in their seats, unsure how to respond. Lucas's glare burned, his ego wounded. Victoria forced a tight smile, concealing the surprise, but her eyes betrayed it. Daniel did not flinch. He let the moment linger, each tick of silence amplifying the weight of his revelation. The waiters moved efficiently, placing dessert in front of each guest, oblivious to the subtle war of pride and revelation taking place. Daniel's fingers brushed the stem of his water glass, then Eleanor's again, a brief but intentional touch that reinforced the moment. He was no longer invisible, no longer the peripheral cousin dismissed for quiet choices. He was central, commanding, not with force, but with truth. Lucas finally attempted to regain control, leaning forward with a forced laugh. "Well, that's impressive, but let's not get carried away. A foundation is nice, Daniel, really, but will it generate real influence, real power?" Daniel smiled faintly, a trace of warmth in the corner of his mouth. "Influence and power," he said, voice steady, "come in many forms. Some you can flaunt, others you build quietly, and they ripple out further than you imagined. We'll see which lasts longer," the cousins murmured, curiosity piqued, whispers now passing back and forth. Marianne leaned forward, eyebrow raised. "Community centers, scholarships, and one of Lucas's investors? Are you serious?" "Yes," Daniel said simply. "All of it. Planned, funded, ready to launch. And yes, that investor recognized the potential we created quietly, without fanfare." The table was silent for a beat that stretched like taut string. Even Lucas hesitated, the weight of a different truth pressing against his sense of superiority. He had lived his life for display, for flash, for applause. And here was Daniel, the supposedly invisible cousin, standing calm, confident, untouchable in the elegance of his restraint and the power of his intellect. Victoria cleared her throat, tilting her head slightly. "Well," she said carefully, "I suppose one cannot ignore initiative, even if it comes from unexpected quarters." Her voice was measured, attempting to reclaim authority, but Daniel's words had already resonated. Eleanor leaned closer, brushing his hand once more, their fingers intertwining under the table. Her voice was soft, intimate, but audible enough to make the surrounding cousins aware. "See, quiet determination can be irresistible." Daniel felt a lightness, a thrill beneath his calm. The table's tension, the subtle humiliation, the unspoken challenge, they had all built up to this moment. And yet, he didn't gloat. He had proven more than their assumptions. He had reclaimed dignity with authenticity, intelligence, and the understated drama of truth. Lucas's face had drained of color, a mix of humiliation and disbelief. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. No words could immediately topple the quiet authority Daniel now radiated. The room had shifted. Respect, tentative, grudging, but undeniably present, hovered over the polished surfaces, the gold accents, the soft futuristic hum of lights and screens. A cousin whispered, I didn't see that coming. Another nodded, eyes wide. Daniel could see envy, curiosity, admiration, all mingling in the same glance. Eleanor's gaze met his, playful, teasing, confident. He returned it, a small, knowing smile curling his lips. They had won this moment together, silently, elegantly, without a word raised in anger. The final course arrived, delicate pastries sculpted into impossible shapes, shimmering with holographic sugar dust. Daniel picked up a small slice, tasting it without ceremony. He felt light, as if the invisible chains of expectation had fallen away. Beside him, Eleanor brushed his hand again, leaning in just enough for warmth and promise to radiate. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "they'll talk about this dinner for weeks. You've changed the game." "I didn't change the game," Daniel replied softly. "I just played it honestly." They shared a brief, intimate smile, glasses raised in a subtle toast only they could fully understand. Around the table, the room seemed to hum with the recognition of a new hierarchy, one built not on display or flash, but on patience, quiet intelligence, and integrity. Daniel had turned judgment into respect, scorn into admiration, and done it without cruelty, without violence, just by being himself and holding on to the truth he had always known. The ambient music swelled as the night drew to its close, the light catching in Elena's emerald dress, reflecting off Daniel's understated, watchless wrist. They stood side by side, acknowledging the room without arrogance, carrying a presence that could not be ignored. The family murmured among themselves, some whispering excitement, others chafing at envy, all aware that the tables had turned. Daniel looked out over the city through the glass walls, neon streams of light painting the skyline in motion, a future bright and unknowable. But tonight, in this golden room, he had claimed his place. And in Elena's hand over his, in the heat of their shared glance, he realized that some victories were sweeter than any monetary gain. Some triumphs came quietly, elegantly, and with a touch of intimacy that made the world pause for just a heartbeat. He raised his glass again, Eleanor matching him, a silent celebration of patience, strategy, and loyalty, the investments that mattered most. Around them, the family sat in stunned recognition. The night was Daniel's. The legacy he had built quietly for years now shone under the soft gold light, undeniable and lasting. And for the first time, Daniel felt entirely, completely free.